The container ship is 300 meters long and carries 40,000 tons of cargo, electronics, grain, medical equipment. It moves at 14 knots through the Gulf of Aden, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, connecting Europe to Asia through the narrow throat between Yemen and Somalia. The captain has done this route dozens of times. He knows the risk, he has the protocols, he has the razor wire along the railings, and the water hoses rigged to repel boarders. None of it matters. A skiff appears off the port bow, then another. They're doing 30 knots, which means the ship cannot outrun them. The men inside are young, thin, and carrying AK-47s and a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Within 20 minutes, they are on the bridge. The captain is on his knees. And somewhere in a coastal village in Somalia, a coordinator with a satellite phone is already making calls. The ransom negotiation has begun. To understand what Somalia became, you have to understand what it was before it fell apart. For centuries, the Somali coast was one of the most productive fishing grounds in the western Indian Ocean. The current that sweeps up from the south carries cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface. This upwelling feeds massive schools of tuna, mackerel, and lobster that Somali fishermen had harvested for generations with small boats, hand lines, and nets. It was not a wealthy life, but it was a life. Communities built themselves around the sea, passing knowledge of currents, seasons, and fishing grounds from fathers to sons across centuries. Then the state collapsed. In 1991, after decades of Cold War manipulation, military dictatorship, and clan warfare, the Somali government disintegrated. Not weakened, not destabilized, gone. There was no army, no coast guard, no functioning courts, no tax collection, no central authority of any kind. Somalia became, in the clinical language of international relations, a failed state. In reality, it meant that roughly 10 million people woke up one morning with no government and no protection from anyone willing to take advantage of that fact. The rest of the world noticed almost immediately, not to help, to exploit. Without a coast guard, Somalia's territorial waters were open. International fishing fleets arrived within months. European, Asian, and Middle Eastern trawlers moved into waters Somali fishermen had fished for generations and began industrial-scale harvesting. They used bottom trawlers that dragged weighted nets across the ocean floor, scooping up everything and destroying the reef ecosystems that had sustained coastal communities for centuries. They took yellowfin tuna, lobster, shark fin, anything with commercial value, and paid nothing to anyone. At its peak, an estimated $300 million worth of seafood was being stolen from Somali waters every year by foreign fleets, protected by no one, stopped by no one. It gets worse. With no functioning government to enforce environmental regulations, Somalia's coastline also became a dumping ground. Reports from the early 1990s described European companies paying to deposit toxic and nuclear waste off the Somali coast because it was cheaper than legal disposal in Europe, and there was nobody to say no. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, barrels washed ashore, and coastal communities reported radiation sickness, chemical burns, and unexplained illness clusters in villages near the water. The people who had built their entire lives around the sea watched the sea being taken apart in front of them. Their catches collapsed. Their equipment could not compete with industrial trawlers. Their children went hungry. And no government, Somali or foreign, did anything about it. So some of them decided to do something about it themselves. The early groups did not call themselves pirates. They called themselves the Volunteer Coast Guard of Somalia. This is not revisionism or propaganda. It is what they said, and in the beginning their actions had a certain internal logic that is uncomfortable to dismiss entirely. They boarded foreign fishing vessels, demanded payment for fishing in Somali waters, and released the boats when money changed hands. It was extortion dressed in the language of sovereignty. But the waters they were policing genuinely were Somali waters. The fish being taken genuinely belonged under international law to Somalia. The state that should have been collecting those fees simply did not exist anymore. The international community's response was to classify them as pirates, which they legally were, and to do nothing about the illegal fishing and waste dumping, which continued regardless. The money coming in from these early operations was unlike anything the fishermen had seen. A single successful boarding could pay more than a year of fishing. The word traveled fast along the coast, and the logic shifted. If you could tax a fishing boat, you could tax a cargo ship. If you could demand payment from a trawler, you could demand ransom for a tanker. The moral framework, already strained by desperation, snapped. The volunteer Coast Guard became something else entirely. By the mid-2000s, Somali piracy had become a sophisticated criminal industry, operating with a structure that would be recognizable to anyone who has studied organized crime, or for that matter, early modern merchant companies. Operations were financed by investors, wealthy businessmen in Somali port towns, and later in the diaspora and in Gulf states, provided startup capital in exchange for a share of ransoms. They funded boats, weapons, GPS equipment, satellite phones, and the food and fuel needed for multi-day operations far offshore. Returns on investment ran as high as 400% on a successful hijacking. The financial infrastructure around Somali piracy eventually stretched from Nairobi to Dubai to London. The operational structure was layered. At the bottom were the attack crews, young men from coastal villages who did the actual boarding. They received a flat fee regardless of the ransom outcome. Above them were the negotiators, often men with some English and a talent for the slow, grinding psychological work of extracting maximum payment from shipping companies and their insurers. Above them were the financiers and the logistics coordinators who handled supply chains for vessels holding crews hostage for months at a time. Because the hostage periods were long, this is something that gets lost in the headline version of the story. A successful hijacking did not end in days. The negotiation process for a large cargo ship could take 6 months, sometimes longer. Crews of 20 or 30 sailors, often Filipino, Indian, Ukrainian, lived aboard their own captured ship, anchored off the Somali coast, guarded by rotating teams of armed young men, while lawyers and insurance adjusters in London and Hamburg argued over the precise number of millions that would secure their release. The ransom would eventually be packed into waterproof bags and dropped from a light aircraft into the ocean beside the ship, where pirates retrieved it by speedboat. The crew was released, the ship sailed, the investors divided the proceeds according to agreed-upon shares, and the cycle began again. Between 2008 and 2011, Somali piracy conducted more than 600 attacks and successfully hijacked over 150 vessels. At the peak in 2011, they were holding roughly 3,000 sailors hostage at any given moment. The total ransom paid across those years exceeded $400 million. The visible transformation of the towns where piracy was centered, particularly Ale and Hobyo on the northeastern coast, was evident. New houses appeared, cement replacing the corrugated iron and mud brick of old construction. Toyota Land Cruisers materialized on streets that had seen nothing but donkeys for years. Young men who had grown up with nothing wore imported clothes and carried the latest phones. The local economy reorganized itself around the industry. Women cooked for pirate crews guarding ships. Cot sellers extended credit to pirates waiting on ransoms. Elders who once would have condemned the practice privately accepted donations for mosques and community projects. The pirates were not alien invaders. They were sons and nephews and neighbors, and their money kept communities alive in a country where the alternative was starvation. This is the part that disrupts the clean moral narrative. The men terrorizing Filipino sailors and Ukrainian engineers and holding cargo ships to ransom were the same men whose fathers had watched foreign trawlers strip the ocean bare while the world looked away. The violence was real. The grievance was also real. These two facts do not cancel each other out. They just make the story harder to tell neatly. The world's navies eventually showed up. Combined Task Force 151, a multinational naval coalition including warships from the United States, European Union, China, Russia, India, and a dozen other nations, began patrolling the Gulf of Aden. Warships that between them represented the most expensive naval technology in human history were deployed to stop men in small fiberglass boats carrying Kalashnikovs. It worked, partially. The heavily patrolled corridor through the Gulf of Aden became harder to operate in, but the pirates adapted. They moved farther offshore, striking targets in the middle of the Indian Ocean, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest land. They used motherships, larger captured vessels that carried skiffs and attack crews deep into open water, extending their operational range beyond anything the early Coast Guard fishermen had imagined. The shipping industry also adapted. Vessels transiting the region hired armed guards, ships increased their speed, razor wire and water cannons became standard equipment, insurance premiums spiked. A study estimated that Somali piracy was costing the global economy somewhere between $6 and $7 billion per year in additional security costs, rerouting, insurance, and naval operations. All of this to suppress an industry that at its peak was collecting perhaps $150 million in ransoms annually. The world was spending $40 to prevent every $1 of piracy. The economics made no sense, but the alternative, allowing a precedent where non-state actors could effectively tax global maritime trade, was unacceptable to every nation whose economy depended on ships moving freely between continents. By 2013, the piracy boom was effectively over, not because Somalia was fixed. Somalia was not fixed. The coastlines were still unprotected. The foreign trawlers were still operating. The waste dumping had not been prosecuted. The communities that had produced pirates remained desperately poor. The industry collapsed because the economics shifted. Armed guards made successful boardings rare enough that the risk-to-reward calculation changed. Investors who had been funding operations began pulling back when hijacking stopped producing returns. The organizational networks that had been built up during the boom years frayed. And Al-Shabaab, the militant Islamist movement that controlled parts of southern Somalia, began taxing pirate operations so heavily that the profit margins disappeared. The young men who had ridden the boom were left with a land cruiser depreciating in a courtyard, a reputation that made employment elsewhere impossible, and, in many cases, serious legal jeopardy if they ever traveled internationally. The investors who had funded operations from comfortable offices in Nairobi and Dubai largely escaped consequences. This, too, was a pattern history had seen before. Piracy in the Western Indian Ocean did not end, it shifted. In the years following the Somali peak, piracy in West Africa, particularly in the Gulf of Guinea off Nigeria, increased sharply and by some measures surpassed the Somali threat in terms of violence. The dynamics were different, but the underlying logic was identical. State failure combined with proximity to extremely valuable maritime trade, plus communities with no economic alternative, produces pirates. It has always produced pirates. It will continue to produce pirates until the underlying conditions change, which requires the kind of sustained international attention to poverty, governance, and resource theft that is considerably less exciting than a multinational naval task force and generates far fewer dramatic photographs. The fishermen who became pirates, and the pirates who became negotiators, and the negotiators who became financiers were not unique in history. They were filling a vacuum the way humans have always filled vacuums, with whatever combination of desperation and opportunity the moment provided. Empires leave water. Someone always fills it. The only question is what they become when they do.